They champion the Victorians for their gaslight, their science, their rigid sense of order. They show you the polished facades of Westminster and the hushed sanctity of the British Museum. But scratch the gilded surface of any great era, and what you find isn't civilization, but a carefully concealed rot. The true line between piety and savagery, friends, is thinner than a pauper's thread. What happens when the most honorable man in the room, the man devoted to historical truth, realizes the only honest act left is one of pure destruction? And that, right there, is where we find Mr. Elias Thorne. Elias was a curator, a guardian of the past. For 20 years, he had tended the rare books and antiquities at the esteemed Ashworth Collection, a dusty, hallowed space off Bloomsbury Square. He possessed an unshakable scholarly morality, valuing the integrity of a footnote more than the gold in his pocket. He was a creature of routine, his tweed suit dusted with the ghosts of centuries, his greatest passion the preservation of fragile, forgotten truths. He was quiet, unassuming, a man you'd expect to fade into the fog, yet he was the anchor of the collection's prestige. In a society obsessed with status, Elias was devoted only to substance. His flaw? His unwavering belief that scholarly honesty was a shield against the vulgarity of ambition. A belief that positioned him directly in the crosshairs of Lord Alistair Vance. Vance was the gilded rival, a young, ambitious social climber who saw history not as truth, but as a ladder. He had the right pedigree, the right tailor, and the chilling, sharp edges of a man determined to seize prestige without earning it. Vance resented Thorne's quiet authority, his unflappable integrity, which made Vance's own shallow research look exactly like what it was: a performance. The collection's oldest and most treasured item was the 15th century Pilgrim's Psalter, valued far beyond its weight in diamonds. Vance coveted the curator position, and Elias stood in his way. The snap in the polite society of the 1880s wasn't a pistol shot. It was a carefully planted lie. The trap sprang during a high-profile inspection. Vance, using his social cachet and a month of tireless manipulation, had framed Elias. He didn't steal the Psalter, that was clumsy. Instead, he replaced two critical aged pages with perfect modern forgeries, pages that contained a meticulously fabricated error. Vance then produced evidence showing Thorne had knowingly accepted a massive bribe from a competing collector years ago to destroy the artifact's provenance, thus rendering it worthless to the Ashworth. The accusation wasn't theft, it was scholarly vandalism and corruption. It was tailor-made to destroy the very thing Elias was, a keeper of truth. The press, hungry for scandal, called him a Judas. The termination was immediate. His modest funds were seized pending investigation. Within 48 hours, Elias was stripped of his position, his reputation was dirtied beyond redemption, and his life's work had been turned into the object of scorn in the unforgiving glare of London's gaslight. Vance naturally took over the collection, sighing solemnly about the moral decay of the old guard. Elias stood on the cold cobblestones of Bloomsbury, watching the light dim on his life's work. He didn't weep. He didn't rage. The goodness didn't flee. It calcified into a diamond-hard resolve. In that absolute, hollowed-out silence, the curator died, and the meticulous architect of historical retribution was born. The moral code was discarded, swept into the fog with his name. The newly born Elias Thorne did not seek lawyers, he sought silence. He retreated to a dingy, furnished room in Whitechapel, a world away from the hallowed halls of his past. He wasn't looking to prove his innocence to a society that had already judged him. He was looking to prove Vance's guilt to the only judge that mattered, history itself. His rage was not the heat of a furnace, but the pure, refined cold of an alchemist's flask. Elias was a scholar, and his revenge would be a doctoral thesis on destruction. Alistair Vance, you see, was defined by his unearned prestige and his profound, deep-seated fear of social and ancestral ruin. In Victorian London, money bought power, but a tarnished family name, a blot, bought permanent exclusion. Vance didn't fear death. He feared his lineage being exposed as a fraud. Elias knew this from years of quietly cross-referencing society's carefully curated lies. Elias began by creating a counter-narrative. It wasn't about the Psalter. It was about Vance's core identity. He utilized the tools available, obscure chemicals, old archival ink, and the pervasive power of the city's scandal sheets, which operated outside the purview of Scotland Yard. The revenge had to be poetic. It had to deliver a customized, era-specific terror. Physical harm was vulgar. Elias wanted social and psychological vivisection. He first focused on the ancestral blot. Elias knew that Vance traced his pedigree back to an esteemed baronet of the early 18th century. Elias, leveraging his expertise in 18th century paper, watermarks, and cryptographic conventions, created a flawless forgery, a brief, damning letter, supposedly written by the baronet's lawyer. This letter, dated 1740, detailed a transaction involving the intentional sale of a family ward into indentured servitude, a morally repugnant act that would destroy Vance's family's social standing overnight. This letter was carefully slipped into a sealed but unsecured section of a minor aristocratic archive at the city records. Next, the psychological torment. Elias knew that Vance suffered from acute, if hidden, social anxiety and a fear of losing control in public. Elias's knowledge of botanical history offered a solution: Digitalis Purpurea, or foxglove. Not the crude, fatal poison, but a highly diluted, subtle tincture, easy enough to prepare from a common garden plant that, when administered in small doses, could induce brief, acute visual disturbances, social paranoia, and temporary delusional episodes that mimicked a complete mental collapse. Crucially, the effects were non-fatal, fleeting, and utterly untraceable by the rudimentary forensic toxicology of the 1880s. The complexity was breathtaking. Elias wasn't just planting a forged document. He was preparing a historical explosion and a personalized toxin. The quiet curator, once so devoted to preserving history, was now expertly creating the very scandal that would define and ultimately doom his enemy. He was sustained only by the chilling logic of his plan, waiting for the night the curtain would fall on Lord Alistair Vance. The moment was set for the annual Patrons' Ball at the Royal Geographic Society, a summit of London's elite where Vance was slated to receive a prestigious historical fellowship. He was at his absolute zenith, and precisely where Elias wanted him. Elias wasn't there physically. He was observing from a dim balcony across the square, the gaslight reflecting in the lens of his modest opera glasses. His revenge was a silent, atmospheric plague enacted by his own invisible hand. The first domino fell with the simple exchange of a glass. Elias had bribed a lower-rank footman to substitute Vance's pre-dinner Madeira with a glass containing the subtle Digitalis tincture. The poison did not kill. It did something far more devastating in the context of Victorian society. It removed the mask of control. As Vance took the podium, a slight sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. He tried to speak about his dedication to historical truth, but his eyes darted nervously. Then the visual disturbances began. The elegant hall, the high society faces, they seemed to warp, to twist into mocking gargoyles. Vance began to stammer. The truth is a lie. All lies. He clutched the podium. Then, in a terrifying display of lost control, he began to address the audience not as patrons, but as shadowy figures from his own ancestral past. He began to loudly confess to invented paranoid crimes, screaming about the stain and the betrayal of the blood. It was a complete, terrifying, and public delusion that lasted barely 5 minutes. He was escorted out, labeled a madman. A spectacle of madness was merely the prelude. The second act began the next morning. The scandal sheets, those ruthless purveyors of Victorian gossip, received an anonymous, meticulously typed tip directing them to the city records. Within hours, the forged 1740 letter about the selling of the indentured ward was found, authenticated by an unsuspecting low-level archivist, and splashed across the pages of the Daily Chronicle. The headline was not about a theft or a forgery. It was about a bloodstain that cannot be washed away. The horror wasn't the theft of a book, it was the theft of ancestral honor. In Victorian society, a public mental breakdown followed by the revelation of a deep, historical moral stain was a death sentence. Patrons withdrew their support. His fiancée broke off the engagement. His associates now viewed him with a mixture of pity and revulsion, the worst fate for a man of prestige. Vance wasn't just ruined, he was ostracized, declared morally and mentally unfit. The academic, who valued reputation above all else, had been stripped of both, rendered entirely invisible by the same society he had coveted. By the end of the week, Vance was gone from London, fleeing the relentless, quiet destruction orchestrated by the former curator, who had leveraged his knowledge of history and his understanding of the Victorian soul to enact the perfect, non-fatal, horrifying act of social execution. Elias Thorne sat alone in his tiny, cheerless room, the smell of coal smoke and old paper his only companions. The final newspaper clipping lay before him, a brief mention that Lord Alistair Vance had retired to the continent due to severe nervous exhaustion. The world had absorbed the scandal, deemed it satisfyingly dramatic, and moved on. The betrayal that destroyed Elias's life had merely provided the world with the context to erase Vance's. Did Elias feel satisfaction? This is where the cold truth reveals itself, my friends. Because when the architectural machine of retribution had finally completed its work, Elias found nothing but the echo of silence. He had traded his gentle, scholarly goodness for a moment of flawless, surgical control. The hole left by Thomas Vance's betrayal hadn't been filled by justice. It was still a gaping void. He hadn't healed his soul by destroying another's. He had merely proven that the ability to commit calculated poetic cruelty lives dormant in even the most honorable hearts. The former curator, the man who lived for truth, had become the author of the most perfect historical forgery London had ever seen. He was still the man in the damp, lonely room, a ghost of his past, living with a future that was terrifyingly empty. The moral code was gone, replaced only by the cold, hard memory of efficiency. Was the revenge worth the cost? It's the ultimate paradox of the villain's journey. Arthur, staring into the flickering gaslight of his room, his face etched with the shadow of his own making, knew the answer. He had proven his intellect, yes, but he had lost his humanity in the process. He didn't find peace. He found only a terrible equilibrium. They tell you that the Victorians achieved order through rigid morality. But scratch the gilded surface of any great era, and what you find isn't civilization, but a carefully concealed rot. The true line between piety and savagery, friends, is thinner than a pauper's thread. And when the most honorable man in the room realizes the only honest act left is one of pure destruction, you get a vacuum where humanity used to be. And that terrifying, hollow silence is the true, unchanging history of mankind. Do not hesitate to let us know how you feel about revenge in the comments section, whether it is the right path to trade when you're stabbed in the back by a friend or ally. Does it heal the wound, or does it leave you in a far worse emotional situation? Please like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling contents. Thank you.